In the winter of 1908, West Virginia Appalachians. The most sinister secret in Appalachian history, the boy who spoke to the mountain. In the winter of 1908, a hunting party discovered something in a hollow near Seneca Creek, West Virginia, that would haunt the collective memory of 3 counties for generations. Inside an abandoned root cellar, partially collapsed from decades of neglect, they found the preserved body of a child seated upright against the earthen wall. The boy, estimated to be perhaps 9 or 10 years old, appeared almost alive in the dim lantern light, his skin darkened and leather-like from natural mummification in the dry, cold space. His hands were positioned as if in prayer or supplication, fingers interlaced and raised toward his chin. But what stopped the hunters' breath in their throats was not the body itself. It was what surrounded him. Carved into every available surface of the cellar, the wooden support beams, the stone foundation, the earthen walls themselves, were thousands upon thousands of identical symbols, a simple geometric pattern resembling a mountain peak with a single line descending from its summit. Some markings were crude, scratched with fingernails into packed dirt. Others had been meticulously etched into wood with what must have been a blade or sharp stone. The symbols covered every inch of the small space, overlapping in places, creating a dizzying tapestry of obsessive repetition. Most disturbing of all was the boy's mouth, frozen open in what appeared to be mid-speech, and the final symbol, larger than all the others, carved directly into the dirt floor between his outstretched legs, still bearing the impression of small fingers that had traced it over and over until the earth itself seemed to remember the pattern. Wait, before we proceed to the archives. If this enigma has already captured your curiosity, tell us where in the world you're joining this investigation from. To make sure you never miss another hidden truth or forgotten theory, subscribe and join our search. History has not yet revealed all of its secrets. Now, back to the facts. The discovery was made on February 14, 1908, by members of the Ketterman family, respected hunters and trappers who had worked the hollows and ridges of Pendleton County for 3 generations. According to the account recorded by Deputy Sheriff Thomas Varner, who was summoned to the scene the following morning, the hunters had been tracking a wounded buck when they noticed the partially collapsed structure hidden beneath decades of overgrowth. The cellar had been built into a hillside, its entrance nearly invisible beneath fallen timber and wild rhododendron. What the Kettermans initially took for an old storage cellar revealed itself to be something far stranger upon closer examination. The structure was well constructed, with mortared stone walls and cedar beams that showed little rot despite their age. But it had clearly been sealed deliberately. The wooden door had been nailed shut from the outside, the nails driven so deeply into the frame that rust had welded them to the wood. Someone had wanted to ensure that whatever was inside stayed inside. The boy's body, when examined by Dr. William Hinkle of Franklin, showed no obvious signs of trauma. The natural mummification process, aided by the cellar's unique microclimate of cool, dry air, had preserved the body with remarkable fidelity. His clothing, though fragile, remained largely intact. Homespun wool trousers, a cotton shirt, and leather boots that appeared handmade. The style of dress suggested a time frame somewhere between 1850 and 1880, though Dr. Hinkle cautioned against precise dating based on frontier clothing, which often remained unchanged in style for decades in isolated mountain communities. But it was the symbols that dominated every discussion, every written account, every whispered conversation in the weeks that followed. Dr. Hinkle, who considered himself a man of science and reason, found himself unable to offer a rational explanation for the sheer number of carvings. He estimated, conservatively, that there were more than 8,000 individual symbols covering the cellar's interior. The work would have taken weeks, perhaps months, of continuous effort. The varying depths and weathering of the carvings suggested they had been made over an extended period, with the oldest, deepest marks showing signs of age, and the freshest appearing as though they had been completed mere days before the cellar was sealed. The question that haunted Dr. Hinkle's initial report, written in careful longhand and preserved in the Pendleton County Historical Society archives, was simple and devastating. Who had sealed this child inside? And why had no one come looking for him? The investigation that followed would open doors that many in the community wished had remained closed. Deputy Varner began by consulting the oldest residents of the county, those whose memories reached back to the years before the Civil War. He sought any recollection of a missing child, a family tragedy, or an unexplained disappearance that might provide context for what had been discovered in that hollow. What emerged was not a single clear narrative, but a constellation of fragmented memories and half-forgotten stories that seemed to orbit around a common center of darkness. Several elderly residents recalled, independently of one another, stories their grandparents had told of a speaking boy who had lived somewhere in the high hollows in the years before the war. The details varied. Some said he lived with his mother. Others claimed he was an orphan taken in by a reclusive family, but certain elements remained consistent across the accounts. The boy, they said, had been afflicted with some manner of strangeness from birth. He spoke in patterns rather than sentences, repeating phrases over and over until they lost all meaning. He would stand for hours staring at the mountains, his lips moving silently, as if engaged in conversation with the peaks themselves. Some accounts described him as gentle and harmless, others as unsettling in his intensity. But all agreed on one point. The boy claimed the mountain spoke to him, and he was merely repeating what it said. One account, recorded by Varner in his investigation notes, came from a woman named Prudence Wilfong, then 93 years old, whose family had operated a grist mill on the south branch of the Potomac River. Mrs. Wilfong recalled a day in her childhood, sometime around 1855, when a woman had brought a boy to the mill seeking flour. The boy had stood apart from his mother, facing the mountain ridge to the west, and had begun to speak in a low, monotonous voice. Mrs. Wilfong couldn't recall the exact words, but she remembered the pattern. A phrase repeated 7 times, then silence, then another phrase, also repeated 7 times. Her father had given them the flour and sent them away quickly, troubled by the boy's behavior. Mama said later that the boy was speaking the mountain's name, Mrs. Wilfong told Deputy Varner. Said the mountain had a name that only it could say, and the boy was cursed to repeat it over and over until his tongue wore out or his mind broke. She told me never to listen too close to what the mountains say, because once you hear their true voice, you can never hear anything else again. This account, like so many others gathered during those early weeks of investigation, raised more questions than it answered. What did it mean to speak the mountain's name? Why would such a thing be considered a curse? And how did a boy who spoke in patterns come to be sealed in a cellar surrounded by thousands of identical symbols? The symbols themselves became the focus of intense speculation. Dr. Hinkle made careful tracings of several examples and sent them to colleagues in Charleston and Washington, hoping that someone might recognize them as examples of Native American petroglyphs, early settler markings, or perhaps some form of religious iconography. The responses, when they came, were uniformly baffled. The symbol resembled nothing in the catalogs of known indigenous art from the region. It bore no relationship to any documented European settler tradition. One respondent, a professor of anthropology at George Washington University, suggested it might be an example of what he called spontaneous symbolic language, patterns created by individuals in states of psychological distress or altered consciousness, serving as a kind of personal hieroglyphic with meaning only to the creator. But this explanation failed to account for something Deputy Varner discovered when he returned to the cellar with a team of volunteers to document the scene more thoroughly. The symbols were not confined to the interior of the structure. They had been carved into trees surrounding the cellar in a rough circle with a radius of approximately 100 feet. The oldest of these tree carvings, on ancient oaks and chestnuts whose bark had partially grown over the marks, suggested that the symbols had been placed decades before the cellar itself was built. Someone, or something, had been marking this location long before the boy arrived. The discovery of the tree symbols fundamentally altered the nature of the investigation. What had begun as an attempt to identify a dead child and determine the circumstances of his death had evolved into something stranger, an archaeological puzzle that seemed to stretch backward in time beyond living memory. Varner, a practical man whose law enforcement experience had taught him to trust evidence over speculation, found himself forced to consider possibilities he would have dismissed as folklore just weeks earlier. He began to collect stories not just about the boy, but about the location itself. The hollow where the cellar stood had a name among the oldest families, Silent Valley, though no one could explain exactly when or why it had been so designated. Several hunters reported that game animals avoided the area, even in harsh winters when food was scarce. The forest there, though seemingly healthy, had an unusual quality. Visitors described an absence of birdsong, a heaviness in the air, a sense of being observed by something that never quite revealed itself. One account, provided by a former slave named Isaac Baylor who had gained his freedom before the war and settled in Pendleton County, described an incident from his youth. Baylor had been hired by a white farmer to clear timber in Silent Valley in the late 1840s. While working, he and several other men had heard what they described as a voice coming from the mountain itself. Not from any specific point, but seeming to emanate from the rock and earth. The voice spoke in a language none of them recognized, a series of sounds that hurt to hear, as if the human ear was not designed to process such frequencies. The workers had fled and refused to return, even when threatened with punishment. The farmer eventually gave up the timber operation, claiming the land was cursed. Baylor's account, recorded by Varner in March of 1908, included a detail that made the deputy's blood run cold. He asked Baylor if he could remember any of the sounds the mountain had made. The old man had closed his eyes and attempted to reproduce what he had heard. According to Varner's notes, the sound Baylor made was a kind of humming or droning, rising and falling in a pattern that repeated 7 times, then fell silent, then began again with a slight variation. 7 repetitions. The same pattern Mrs. Wilfong had described the boy using more than 50 years earlier. Varner began to map the accounts chronologically, creating a timeline of strange events associated with Silent Valley and the surrounding ridges. What emerged was a pattern of incidents stretching back to the earliest days of white settlement in the region. A surveyor's journal from 1782 mentioned unusual rock formations in the area and a disquieting atmosphere that made his crew reluctant to camp nearby. A missionary's letter from 1807 described meeting a Cherokee elder who warned him that the valley was sacred and forbidden, a place where the earth spoke and men should not listen. A newspaper article from 1869 reported the disappearance of 3 children from a settlement near Seneca Creek. They were found 2 days later, mute and traumatized, refusing to explain where they had been. The more Varner investigated, the more he became convinced that the boy in the cellar was not an isolated tragedy, but the culmination of something that had been unfolding in this landscape for generations. But what exactly? A curse? A geological phenomenon that affected human psychology? A tradition of ritual sacrifice maintained by some secret cult? Or something else entirely? Something that predated categories and resisted explanation. By April of 1908, Varner's investigation had reached an impasse. He had gathered dozens of accounts, mapped the location of symbol carvings, and documented everything he could about the boy's body and the circumstances of its discovery. But he was no closer to understanding what had happened or why. The boy remained unidentified. No one had come forward to claim him. No records existed of a missing child matching his description. It was as if he had never officially existed, or as if his existence had been deliberately erased from all written records. Dr. Hinkle, meanwhile, had become obsessed with the symbols themselves. He spent hours in the cellar, making tracings and taking measurements, trying to find some pattern or progression in the seemingly random placement of the marks. He began to notice something that disturbed him profoundly. The symbols were not randomly distributed. When plotted on a grid, they formed a kind of topographical map of the surrounding mountains, with certain areas containing dense clusters of marks and others remaining relatively sparse. The densest concentration of symbols corresponded precisely to the location of several natural caves and underground streams in the region. This discovery led Hinkle to propose a theory that he acknowledged sounded like madness even as he wrote it in his journal. What if the boy had been marking not his own obsessive thoughts, but something he had genuinely heard? What if the mountain had indeed been speaking? Not in any supernatural sense, but through some natural phenomenon not yet understood by science. Sounds created by underground water, by the expansion and contraction of rock, by wind moving through hidden passages? And what if this child, for reasons unknown, had possessed an unusual sensitivity to these frequencies, hearing what others could not? It was a rationalist's attempt to explain the inexplicable, and Hinkle knew it was inadequate. It did not explain why the symbols predated the boy's arrival. It did not explain why he had been sealed in the cellar. It did not explain the long history of strange events in Silent Valley. But it was something, a thread of possibility in a tapestry of darkness. The modern investigation of the Silent Valley enigma began not with professional archaeologists or historians, but with a chance encounter in the archives of West Virginia University in 1987. Dr. Ellen Cordray, a graduate student researching Appalachian folkways, discovered Deputy Varner's investigation notes while searching for entirely unrelated material. The accounts of the boy and the symbols struck her as extraordinary, and she made photocopies of everything she could find. It would take her 3 years to convince her department to support a formal investigation of the site. In the summer of 1990, Cordray led a team of archaeologists, folklorists, and geologists to Silent Valley. The cellar, which had been partially filled in after the 1908 investigation, was carefully excavated and documented using modern techniques. The findings were both fascinating and frustrating. Carbon dating of the wooden beams suggested construction around 1860, consistent with the original estimates. But tests on the symbols themselves proved inconclusive. The marks had been made at different times, but the range was too broad to be useful, sometime between 1830 and 1880. More intriguing was the geological survey conducted by Dr. Marcus Webb, a specialist in karst topography and underground hydrology. Webb's team discovered an extensive network of unmapped caves beneath Silent Valley, connected by water-carved passages that extended for miles through the mountain. Using sensitive recording equipment, they documented unusual acoustic properties in several chambers. Certain frequencies, when produced at specific locations, would resonate through the cave system in ways that created harmonic patterns. Webbs described it as a kind of stone organ, with the mountain itself serving as the resonating chamber. Even more remarkably, when these recorded sounds were slowed down and analyzed, they revealed a repeating pattern, a sequence of 7 distinct harmonic variations, followed by silence, followed by the sequence again with subtle modifications. The pattern was not random. It was structured, almost linguistic in its repetition and variation. "I can't explain it," Webb wrote in his preliminary report, "but if I had to describe what we recorded, I would say it sounds like speech. Not human speech, obviously, but communication of some kind. The mountain is, in a very real sense, speaking. Whether anyone should be listening is another question entirely. Cordray's team also conducted extensive research into the historical accounts that Varner had collected. They interviewed descendants of the families mentioned in the 1908 investigation, searched for additional documentary evidence, and attempted to trace the identity of the boy. This last effort proved particularly challenging. Birth and death records from the mid-19th century were sparse in this part of West Virginia, especially for the poorest families living in the most remote hollows. Many children were born and died without ever appearing in official documents. However, Cordray did uncover one tantalizing lead. In the personal papers of a circuit-riding minister named Reverend Samuel Corder, preserved by his descendants in Hardy County, she found a diary entry from August 1866. Corder described visiting a family living in what he called the silent hollow below Seneca Rocks to perform a baptism. The family, whose name he rendered as either Dyer or Dwyer, his handwriting was unclear, consisted of a widow and her son. The boy, Corder noted, was afflicted with strange humors and spoke in patterns rather than sense. The minister found the visit unsettling and cut it short, later writing that there was something unwholesome in that place, as if the very stones harbored ill intent. Corder never returned to that family. His diary contains no further mention of them. But his description of the location matched Silent Valley precisely, and his characterization of the boy's speech aligned with accounts gathered by Deputy Varner. Cordray believed she had found a contemporary reference to the child whose body had been discovered in the cellar. The implications were chilling. If Corder's account from 1866 described the same boy, and if the body was sealed in the cellar sometime in the 1870s based on the style of clothing, then the child would have been creating the symbols and living in or near the cellar for at least a decade, possibly longer. What kind of life had he led during those years? Who had cared for him? And what had finally driven someone to seal him inside? Cordray's investigation also turned up evidence of a folk tradition in the region that had escaped Varner's notice, or perhaps had been deliberately withheld from him by those he interviewed. Several elderly residents, speaking to Cordray in the 1990s with the benefit of temporal distance and changing social attitudes, described a belief system that had existed among certain families in the mountains. These families, they said, believed that the mountains were alive in some sense, and that they occasionally called certain individuals to serve as speakers or translators. These chosen ones would hear the mountain's voice and repeat it, serving as intermediaries between the stone and the human world. According to this tradition, being chosen as a speaker was not an honor, but a curse. The mountain's voice would drive the speaker mad, filling their mind with patterns and sounds that had no human meaning. The speaker would gradually lose the ability to communicate normally, becoming trapped in an endless loop of repetition. Eventually, the speaker would need to be returned to the mountain, a euphemistic phrase that could mean anything from ritual execution to abandonment in a remote location. One informant, who insisted on anonymity even in the 1990s, told Cordray that his great-grandmother had known the boy in the cellar. According to family lore, the child had been the son of a woman who had defied community warnings and settled in Silent Valley. The boy had been born with the mountain's mark on him, meaning he was destined to become a speaker. As he grew, his affliction worsened. He would stand at the edge of the property and repeat the mountain's voice for hours, carving the symbols into anything he could reach. The mother had tried to protect him, but eventually the community decided he had to be dealt with. The cellar had been built specifically to contain him, and when the time came, the mother had been forced to watch as her son was sealed inside. She carved the symbols too, after, the informant said, on the trees around the cellar. That was her way of trying to keep speaking to him, I guess, keep him company while he finished. Cordray could not verify this account independently. The informant refused to provide documentation or family names. The story might have been apocryphal, a latter-day invention to explain a mystery that had become part of local folklore, but it aligned with too many other details to be dismissed entirely. The most disturbing aspect of Cordray's investigation came from an unexpected direction. While reviewing Deputy Varner's notes, she noticed that he had interviewed several individuals who claimed to have heard unusual sounds in Silent Valley in the years immediately following the discovery of the body. Most had dismissed these accounts as products of suggestion and fear, the mind creating phantom sounds in a place already associated with darkness. But Cordray, armed with Dr. Shaw's notes, aligned these accounts with too many other details. The most disturbing aspect of Cordray's investigation came from an unexpected direction. While reviewing Deputy Varner's notes, she noticed that he had interviewed several individuals who claimed to have heard unusual sounds in Silent Valley in the years immediately following the discovery of the body. Most had dismissed these accounts as products of suggestion and fear, the mind creating phantom sounds in a place already associated with darkness. But Cordray, armed with Dr. Shaw's notes, aligned these accounts with too many other details. Webb's geological data recognized that the descriptions matched the harmonic patterns recorded in the cave system. People had been hearing the mountain's voice, and according to their accounts, it had changed. Where once it had been a constant, droning pattern, it had become intermittent and variable, as if searching for something. One hunter described it as like someone calling a name over and over, but in a language made of rocks grinding together. The mountain, it seemed, had lost its speaker. The theoretical frameworks that emerged from Cordray's research represented an attempt to reconcile the folklore, the historical evidence, and the scientific data into a coherent explanation. None of these frameworks was entirely satisfactory, and Cordray herself acknowledged that the truth might be forever beyond reach. But the theories served an important function. They provided a vocabulary for discussing something that seemed to exist at the intersection of geology, psychology, anthropology, and perhaps something older and stranger still. The first major theory, which came to be called the geological sensitivity hypothesis, was championed by Dr. Webb and other scientists involved in the investigation. This theory proposed that certain individuals possessed an unusual neurological sensitivity to infrasound, frequencies below the range of normal human hearing. The cave systems beneath Silent Valley produce these frequencies naturally as a result of underground water flow, rock movements, and other geological processes. Most people would be unaware of these sounds, but a person with the right neural wiring might perceive them as audible tones or patterns. According to this theory, the boy in the cellar had been such a person. His brain was constantly processing infrasound that others could not hear, and he interpreted these signals as speech or communication. The obsessive symbol carving was an attempt to record or translate what he heard, a kind of visual language to represent auditory experiences that had no verbal equivalent. The sealing of the cellar was explained as a primitive quarantine measure, a community's attempt to isolate someone whose behavior they found incomprehensible and threatening. The geological sensitivity hypothesis had the virtue of being testable and grounded in known science. Infrasound does affect human psychology, causing feelings of anxiety, dread, and even visual and auditory hallucinations. Cave systems do produce such frequencies. Neurological diversity is real, and there is no reason to assume that all humans process sensory information identically. But the hypothesis struggled to account for several elements of the Silent Valley case. It did not explain why the symbols predated the boy's arrival, or why they appeared in the same form across decades. It did not address the cultural tradition of speakers that seemed to extend back generations. And it offered no insight into why the community would go to such elaborate lengths, building a cellar, sealing it so thoroughly, if they simply wanted to isolate someone they considered mad. Abandonment or institutionalization would have been simpler solutions. The second major theory, proposed by Dr. Cordray and her colleagues in the anthropology department, was called the ritual tradition model. This theory suggested that the boy had been part of an underground religious or mystical practice that existed in certain Appalachian communities. These practices, possibly derived from a syncretic blend of Cherokee beliefs, Celtic folk religion, and frontier Christianity, might have included ritual communication with natural features understood as sentient or spiritually significant. In this framework, the boy was not afflicted with a neurological condition, but was being trained, voluntarily or otherwise, as a kind of oracle or medium. The symbols were a ceremonial language, and the act of carving them was a ritual practice. The sealing of the cellar was explained as a ritual sacrifice, possibly intended to return the speaker to the earth or to permanently bind him to the location as a kind of guardian spirit. The ritual tradition model accounted for the cultural memory of speakers and for the deliberate, almost ceremonial nature of the cellar's construction and sealing. It explained why the community would have maintained secrecy about the boy's fate. Religious practices outside the Protestant mainstream were often hidden in 19th century Appalachia. And it aligned with documented examples of folk practices from other regions that involved ritual communication with landscapes or sacred sites. However, this theory also had significant weaknesses. There was no direct documentary evidence of such a tradition existing in Pendleton County or the surrounding area. The accounts gathered by Varner and Cordray suggested fear and rejection of the boy, not reverence or ritual significance. And the theory required assuming a level of organization and secrecy that seemed at odds with the historical reality of frontier communities, where information traveled quickly and privately maintained traditions were rare. A third theory emerged from an unexpected quarter. Dr. James Wickline, a psychologist specializing in developmental disorders and trauma, proposed what he called the isolated trauma pattern. After reviewing all available evidence, including photographs of the symbols and descriptions of the boy's behavior, Wickline suggested that the child had been autistic, specifically exhibiting traits consistent with what would now be diagnosed as severe autism with accompanying echolalia and savant-like abilities in pattern recognition. In this interpretation, the boy's repetitive speech was echolalia, his obsessive carving was a self-soothing behavior, and his supposed communication with the mountain was actually an acute sensitivity to environmental sounds that he processed and repeated without understanding. The symbols were not language, but a visual stim, repeated endlessly because the act of carving provided sensory regulation. The community, lacking any framework for understanding autism, would have interpreted his behavior as possession, madness, or spiritual affliction. The sealing of the cellar in this reading was a horrific but historically consistent response to developmental disability in an era when such conditions were attributed to moral failing, divine punishment, or demonic influence. The boy had been imprisoned, perhaps with the intention of providing food and care through an opening that was later discovered to have been sealed and had either died of neglect or had been deliberately killed by a community that saw no other option. Wickline's theory was praised for its compassionate reframing of the boy as a victim of historical ignorance rather than a supernatural enigma. It explained the behavior patterns without requiring unusual geological or religious phenomenon. But critics noted that it failed to account for several key elements, the symbols predating the boy's presence, the acoustic patterns recorded in the caves, and the extensive cultural memory of similar phenomena in the same location across different time periods. None of these theories achieved consensus. Each had its advocates and detractors, and each, in its own way, seemed to miss something essential about the case, some element that refused to fit into any single explanatory framework. Perhaps the most unsettling contribution to the theoretical literature came from Dr. Cordray herself, in a paper published in 1996 titled "Listening to Stone: The Epistemological Crisis of Silent Valley." In this essay, Courtrai argued that the very attempt to explain the boy through modern categories, psychological, geological, anthropological, represented a form of colonization, imposing contemporary frameworks onto an experience that might have been fundamentally different from anything those frameworks could accommodate. What if, she asked, the boy really had been hearing something? Not infrasound, not hallucinations, not ritual training, but something else, some form of communication or phenomenon for which science had no vocabulary and no measuring instruments. What if the mountain really was speaking, in some sense that was neither supernatural nor reducible to mechanical vibration? What if there were forms of perception, forms of experience that existed outside the narrow range of what modern epistemology could acknowledge? We assume that we know what counts as real, Courtrai wrote, but reality is notoriously indifferent to our assumptions. The boy carved symbols for years, perhaps decades. He heard something. Whether that something fits into our categories of explanation is our problem, not his. Perhaps the most honest thing we can say is simply this: something happened in Silent Valley that we cannot fully explain. Something spoke, or seemed to speak, and a child paid the ultimate price for listening. The paper was controversial. Some colleagues praised it as a necessary challenge to scientific hubris. Others dismissed it as mysticism masquerading as scholarship. But it marked a shift in how the Silent Valley case was discussed. Increasingly, researchers acknowledged that some mysteries might be irreducible, not because we lacked sufficient data, but because the phenomena themselves existed at the edges of what human cognition could process. In the years following Courtrai's initial investigation, Silent Valley became a minor pilgrimage site for those interested in Appalachian mysteries and unexplained phenomena. The cellar was eventually sealed again, this time with a concrete cap to prevent vandalism and further deterioration. A small historical marker was placed nearby, though its text was deliberately vague, referring only to an archaeological site of historical significance without mentioning the boy or the symbols. Local attitudes toward the site remained ambivalent. Some residents embraced the attention and the modest tourist traffic it brought. Others resented what they saw as outsiders sensationalizing a family tragedy for entertainment. The divide often fell along generational lines, with younger people more willing to discuss the case openly and older residents maintaining a guarded silence. In 2003, a team from the University of Kentucky conducted a follow-up geological survey using more advanced equipment than had been available to Dr. Webb in 1990. The findings confirmed and extended Webb's conclusions. The cave system beneath Silent Valley was even more extensive than originally believed, with passages connecting to other valleys and possibly extending under Seneca Rocks itself. The acoustic properties were confirmed and refined. Certain chambers acted as natural amplifiers, while others produced unusual echo patterns that could create the impression of rhythmic or patterned sound. But the 2003 team also discovered something new. Using ground-penetrating radar, they identified what appeared to be a large void space deep beneath the location where the cellar had stood. The void was too deep to access without major excavation, but its size and shape suggested a natural cave chamber approximately 30 feet across and 15 feet high. The entrance or connection to the larger cave system was unclear. The existence of this chamber raised disturbing questions. Had the cellar been built directly above this void deliberately? Was the location chosen for its proximity to whatever natural phenomenon occurred in that deep chamber? And most unsettling, was it possible that the sounds the boy heard had been coming not from distant caves or underground water, but from directly beneath his feet? No excavation was attempted. The technology and funding required would have been substantial, and the potential scientific value was deemed insufficient to justify the cost. The void remains unexplored, a hollow space in the earth beneath a hollow in human understanding. The boy's body, meanwhile, had been interred in 1908 in the county cemetery under a plain stone marked only with the date of his discovery. In 2005, Dr. Cordray arranged for a more substantial memorial to be placed at the grave. The stone bore a simple inscription, "The Child of Silent Valley, unknown but not forgotten." The choice not to include the phrase "who spoke to the mountain" was deliberate. Cordray felt that such language risked reducing the boy to a curiosity rather than honoring him as a human being who had suffered. The memorial dedication attracted several dozen people, including descendants of Deputy Varner and Dr. Hinkle, some of Cordray's former research team, and a surprising number of local residents who had never spoken publicly about the case. During the informal gathering that followed, an elderly woman approached Cordray privately. She identified herself as a granddaughter of Prudence Wilfong, the woman who had told Varner about encountering the boy and his mother at the mill. "My grandmother left something out when she talked to the deputy," the woman said. "She was afraid of saying it, thought it made her sound crazy. But she told my mother, and my mother told me." When the boy was standing there repeating those sounds, my grandmother said she felt something change in the air, like the whole world was listening to him. And for just a moment, she swore this was true. For just a moment, she could hear it too, what he was saying. She said it was the loneliest sound she'd ever heard, like the mountain was calling for something or someone that had been lost so long ago that even the stones had almost forgotten. And the boy was just echoing that call, passing it along because nobody else could. The woman would say nothing more. She left before Cordray could ask follow-up questions, and attempts to contact her later were unsuccessful. The account remains unverified, another thread in the tapestry of testimony surrounding Silent Valley. Perhaps the strangest postscript to the case came in 2012, when a graduate student in linguistics named Thomas Oakes published a paper analyzing the symbol from the cellar. Oakes had become interested in the case after reading Cordray's work and had obtained permission to examine the original tracings made by Dr. Hinkle. Using computational analysis, Oakes compared the symbol to thousands of examples of human-created marks from various cultures and time periods. His conclusion was startling. The symbol was not random or arbitrary. Its geometric proportions matched with remarkable precision the topographical profile of the mountain ridge visible from the cellar's location. The peak and descending line were not abstract shapes, but a simplified representation of the actual landscape. More than that, the ratio between the peak height and the line length corresponded to a mathematical constant found in natural branching patterns, the angle at which rivers split, trees divide, and lightning forks. It's as if, Oakes wrote, the symbol is trying to capture something about how the landscape is structured at a fundamental level, not just what it looks like, but what it is. If the boy was trying to translate what he heard, maybe this is what translation looks like, reducing something complex and infinite to its most essential geometric truth. The paper was largely ignored by mainstream academics, but found an enthusiastic audience among those who followed the Silent Valley case. It suggested that the boy's obsessive carving had not been meaningless repetition, but a genuine attempt at communication or understanding. He had been trying to translate the mountain's voice into a form that human eyes could comprehend, using the only language available to him: shape, line, and pattern. Whether he succeeded, whether the symbols actually convey anything beyond the desperation of a frightened, isolated child, is impossible to determine. The symbols remain, preserved in archives and photographs, saying nothing and everything. Today, Silent Valley is quiet. The cellar is sealed, the symbols hidden beneath concrete and earth. The forests have grown back over the areas cleared for archaeological work. Birdsong has returned, though some hikers still report an unusual quiet to the silence in certain spots, as if the air is holding its breath. The cave system continues its ancient work, water wearing its stone, passages collapsing and forming in the darkness. The void beneath where the cellar stood remains unexplored, its secrets intact. If sounds still echo in those depths, if the mountain still speaks, there is no one positioned to hear. In Pendleton County, the story of the boy who spoke to the mountain has settled into the category of local legend, known to some, dismissed by others, invoked occasionally when conversation turns to the strangeness of the mountains and the mysteries they hold. The cemetery stone with Cordray's inscription attracts occasional visitors, though most come not because they knew the story, but because the phrase "unknown but not forgotten" speaks to a more universal loneliness. Dr. Cordray retired from academic life in 2018, though she continues to correspond with researchers interested in the case. In her final published paper on the subject, she reflected on what decades of investigation had taught her about the limits of knowledge and the persistence of mystery. "We want our questions to have answers," she wrote. "We want the dead to speak clearly, the evidence to align, the pattern to emerge. But some stories resist that kind of resolution. The boy in Silent Valley remains unknown, his experience beyond our reach. We can theorize about infrasound and autism and ritual tradition, but these are our words, our frameworks. They tell us more about how we make sense of the world than about what that child actually experienced as he carved symbol after symbol into the earth, listening to something the rest of us could not hear. Perhaps the most respectful thing we can do is acknowledge that gap, the space between what happened and what we can understand. The boy heard something. He tried to record it, to translate it, to make it visible. For years, maybe for his entire short life, he devoted himself to that impossible task. And in the end, he was sealed away from the world, left alone in the dark with his symbols and his obsession. If the mountain spoke, we will never know what it said. If the boy understood it, that understanding died with him. All that remains is the record of his attempt, thousands of identical marks, each one a moment of his life spent trying to bridge the gap between sound and meaning, between the mountain and the human world. In that sense, his work continues. Every time we look at those symbols and wonder what they mean, we are participating in the translation he started. We are listening, as he listened, to something that may never fully resolve into sense. The mountain may still be speaking, but its speaker is gone, and we are left to wonder what has been lost in that silence. What knowledge, what understanding, what truth about the relationship between humans and the ancient earth we inhabit? The boy carved the same symbol 8,000 times, and we still do not know what it means. Perhaps we never will. Perhaps that uncertainty is the only honest answer we can offer. The archives are still open. The research continues, sporadically, as new people discover the case and bring fresh perspectives to old evidence. The geological surveys generate new data. The descendants of those who knew something, or think they did, occasionally come forward with stories that may or may not be accurate. But the essential mystery remains intact, preserved as surely as the boy's body had been preserved in the cold, dry air of the cellar. Something happened in Silent Valley in the middle years of the 19th century. A child heard something, or believed he heard something, or was made to believe it by forces beyond his control or understanding. He carved symbols trying to capture that sound, that voice, that presence. And when his usefulness or his endurance came to an end, he was sealed away in the earth, his mouth open in what might have been prayer or plea, or simply the continuation of his endless repetition. The mountain stands above the hollow, its ridges dark against the sky. Water moves through hidden passages, creating sounds that no human ear is positioned to hear. The void beneath the old cellar site remains unexamined, its chamber holding whatever secrets stone and darkness preserve. And somewhere in the county archives, in boxes and folders and carefully preserved documents, the tracings of those 8,000 symbols wait for someone to finally understand what they mean, or to accept that meaning, like so much else about this case, may be forever beyond reach. The boy spoke. The mountain listened, or spoke, or remained silent in a way that only sounded like speech. And we are left with the record of that conversation, marks in earth and wood and stone, testament to an attempt at understanding that cost everything and achieved what? We cannot say. The mountains keep their secrets better than we keep ours. They were here before we arrived, and they will remain after we are gone. What they say to each other in the long dark, what voices move through their caves and passages, what listening requires of those who hear, these are questions that have no comfortable answers. In Silent Valley, the silence continues. But for those who know the story, who have stood where the cellar once stood and tried to imagine what a child heard there, the silence sounds different. It sounds like waiting, like holding space for words that were spoken once and never understood, for a translation that was attempted and never completed, for a conversation between stone and flesh that ended without resolution. The boy who spoke to the mountain is gone, but the mountain remains, and the question that has haunted Pendleton County for more than a century persists. What was it saying? And why did only one child hear its voice clearly enough to spend his life, and lose it, trying to make the rest of us understand? We may never know. The archives preserve the attempt. The symbols mark the effort. The void beneath the earth holds whatever truths the living cannot reach. And the mountain, indifferent to our need for answers, continues its ancient work, speaking or silent, knowing or unknowing, while the hollow that bears its name waits for someone else to listen or for the conversation to finally end.